Actually, our speaker, Dr. Alexander Wynne, was also chairing the section the other day, but let me introduce the speaker once again to the audience. Dr. Alexander Wynne is the Assistant Academic Director at the Oxford Centre for Buddhist Studies and Joint Editor of the Journal of the Oxford Centre for Buddhist Studies. His work focuses on the intellectual history of Indian Buddhism and the Theravada tradition. Dr. Alexander Wynne is also the author of influential publications, and to name some of them, The Origin of Buddhist Meditation, published by Routledge in 2007, and Buddhism, an Introduction, published in 2015. So not taking much of your time, much of our time, may I cordially invite Dr. Alexander Wynne, who is already on the stage, to deliver the closing lecture. Dr. Alexander Wynne, please.
Okay, we have my presentation. Good afternoon, everybody, and it's a great honor to be speaking here. Thank you, Venerable Dhammasami, for inviting me. And good afternoon to the members of the Sangha and ladies and gentlemen. Just reflecting on what we've been talking about in this conference, I don't think that what we've had enough of is early studies, early Buddhism. We talk a lot about dependent origination. What did the Buddha really teach? How can we know that? Part of what we were talking about included the concepts of pariyatti and patipada. So these concepts first arise in the context of the writing down of the Tipitaka in the 1st century BC. There was a debate. There were some monks who said we should focus on patipada, practice. And then there were other monks who said, no, we should focus on pariyatti, scriptural learning. So what is more important? It's a perennial debate. Back in the 1st century BC in Sri Lanka, it was the monks who promoted pariyatti, scriptural learning. And they used this argument. They said, even if there's a herd of 1,000 cows, young cows to be fed, if they don't have a mother to feed them and nourish them, the tradition will die out. So they compared this to the Buddhist Sangha. They said that even if there are skilled meditators who skilled and adept in vipassana, they won't be able to penetrate the path without learning pariyatti. So that is the importance of pariyatti in the Theravada tradition. How do we understand pariyatti now? I would say that we need to understand it also in a historical sense. In the 1st century BC, Theravada Buddhists had a fairly good idea of the Buddha. They were still living in that type of society. It's now it's 2,000 years later. The Buddha is a lot more distant from our understanding of the world. How do we get back to the Buddha? We study the text historically. It's one aspect. So today I'm going to look at one text, a very important text on dependent origination, the Mahatanha-sankhaya Sutta. So just to repeat what I've been saying then, how should we study the Pali tradition? Do we study the Pali texts as an aspect of Theravada, or can we study them independently? How do we understand a thinker like Buddhaghosa? The Pali tradition with the Visuddhimagga, the Abhidhammatta-sangaha, all these great texts. Do we need them to study the Buddha? What about other thinkers, Vasubandhu, the Sarvastivadin tradition? Now, no doubt these thinkers, all of these great traditions have much to tell us. But from a historical perspective, they're saying something a little bit different. In particular, they belong to different periods of thought. Buddhaghosa, Vasubandhu, they belong to exegetical traditions, traditions of interpretation which develop over the years, over the centuries, over the millennia. And what do we know from the teaching of dependent origination? There is continuity, but there is also change. So as a starting point, I just want to introduce 3 terms which are important in the study of Buddhism. First of all, philology is the study of languages. Now, philology is a historical concern. We want to know what words the Buddha used, what ideas he used. Then we have to study, well, what type of world did the Buddha live in? What type of society? Who was he speaking with? So the Buddha is not somebody that comes out of nowhere. He belongs to a time and place. Philology is the way that we study the text and try to understand it from that period of time. So philology is a sort of text critical history. Now this is different but overlaps with exegesis. Exegesis is interpreting the Dhamma. Interpreting the Dhamma is, of course, extremely important. But it's not the same. History is not exegesis. What someone like Buddhaghosa would be doing is not what we do when we study the Buddha historically. There are two different approaches, and the two different approaches can inform each other, and you can gain much out of each other, but it's important to remember that they're different. When we look at the study of early Buddhist texts, well, actually, as an academic discipline, it doesn't really go back very far. Maybe about 150 years in European universities. About that time, the Pali texts have been studied critically, academically. It's a new way of looking at Dhamma. In, I think it was 1881, the Pali Text Society was founded in London, in the United Kingdom, which is almost 150 years, nearly 150 years. So the Pali tradition has been well known in the West for a long time. This gives a sort of misrepresentative idea amongst Western academics about what the Pali tradition is and what should be done with it. Everybody thinks that a lot of work has been done on the Pali tradition. Actually, it's still largely unstudied. The literary history of the Pali tradition is not really understood very well. We haven't really stratified the texts. Now, stratification means separating out the text into different ideas, different periods of time, different developments. So here is a very simple example. It's traditionally held that the Tipitaka is the teaching of the Buddha, which consists of the suttas, the Vinaya, and the Abhidhamma. When we go and look back at the early accounts of, let us say, the first council, so the first council after the Buddha's death in Rajagaha, what do we find? Ananda recites the suttas. Upali recites the Vinaya. Who recites the Abhidhamma? Nobody. The text doesn't say anything about the Abhidhamma then. So the Abhidhamma is this important work of interpreting and understanding the Buddha's teaching. According to the early Buddhist texts, it wasn't there in the beginning. So that is the historical approach. Now, I'm not saying that one is preferable. I'm just saying that there are different approaches. What about dependent origination then? It's such an important doctrine, and we think about it in such received ways. Can we look at the teaching with fresh eyes? Can we think about it differently? Can we question it? Did the idea build up over time? And were the different ideas in the beginning? There are two, I suppose, within the classical 12-fold understanding of dependent origination, I'd say there are two orientations. There is continuity, seemingly continuity over lives. And the Theravada tradition focuses on this. Dependent origination explains continuity without an Atman, a soul. So that is one aspect of looking at dependent origination. Continued experience throughout different lifetimes. Within this doctrine, though, there's another focus. There's a focus on what is happening in the present. What is going on with a person's experience in the present moment? And how is that experience constructed? How can you understand your experience to conquer your suffering? So that is the present moment focus, also dependent origination. How do these two focuses, how do they interact? How do they relate? Well, an interesting text for this is the Mahatanha-sankhaya Sutta. the great discourse on the destruction of thirst. So this text has at least 3 doctrines, 3 versions of dependent origination. Let's look at them now. So the text then is, of course, one of the really, from a historical point of view, and also simply as entertainment, it's a good text, because it starts off with a Buddhist bhikkhu who completely misunderstands the Buddha. So this is good fun. There are a few texts like this where you have a bhikkhu who gets it wrong. And this is what happens in the Mahatanha-sankhaya Sutta. We have a bhikkhu Sati. And Sati, the text keeps telling us, is just a fisherman's son. So a little bit unfair on Sati. Why couldn't a fisherman's son understand the Dhamma? But anyway, he can't. He understands the Dhamma as a form of Upanishadic essentialism. So this is the statement that is attributed to Sati. As I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One, it is this very consciousness which transmigrates, not another. So as the story has it, Sati, the Buddha is staying in Savatthi. Savatthi is one of the main centers of early Buddhism. The Buddha is there, a lot of bhikkhus are there, Sati is there. The bhikkhus hear that Sati has this opinion. And the bhikkhus think, oh dear. They go to see Sati and they say, come on Sati, you can't be serious. You surely can't understand the Dhamma like this. And Sati says again, yes I do, I understand it exactly like this. It is this very consciousness which transmigrates, not another. So they think, my gosh, we better tell the Buddha about this. They go and see the Buddha and tell him everything that has happened. And the Buddha says, oh my gosh, bring Sati here. Tell him that the teacher has summoned him. So they go and get Sati. Sati sits down in front of the Buddha. And the Buddha asks Sati, is this your opinion, Sati? And he says again, as I understand the Dhamma taught by the Blessed One, it is this very consciousness that transmigrates, not another. So finally, after all this, the Buddha says, Sati insults us, he destroys himself, and he keeps on generating much demerit. I think that means that he keeps repeating his mistake. Sati keeps getting it wrong, and he won't back down. So the Buddha does put Sati in his place by using the teaching of dependent origination. However, at the end of the discourse, the Buddha says, remember, this is my concise account of liberation by destroying thirst. Whereas the bhikkhu Sati, the fisherman's son, has got tangled up in a tangle of thirst, a great net of thirst. So a nice joke, a pun. Sati is a fisherman's son, he's caught in a net. But interestingly, this is called a concise teaching. It's in the Majjhima Nikaya, so it's not a long discourse of the Buddha, but it could be. It could easily be in the Digha Nikaya. It's 15 pages long in the Pali Text Society edition, and that's abbreviated. In full, it would probably be about 20 pages. So that is not a concise teaching of the Buddha, as concise teachings of the Buddha are usually understood. So something has happened with the text. As the text has been transmitted, people have added their own things. Okay, so if you can read this, you might be able to see that it's quite a complicated structure that we are dealing with. I'm just giving the analysis of the text according to the paragraphs of the Burmese Chattasanggayana. So it starts off, Sati's wrong view, which we've just looked at. The Buddha counters with teachings about the dependent origination of consciousness. And the Buddha compares this to fire. We will look at that shortly. That is the core of the old text. Then there's a rather mysterious and hard to understand discussion about what has come into being. The Buddha doesn't say what has come into being, and he seems to assume that people will understand him. The text gets a little bit difficult. It gets even more difficult in section 3. 4 nutriments are discussed. We then have a section on personal identity, existing in the future and the past, and how to imagine this. Section 5 is one of these rare passages in the Pali Canon where the subject of transmigration, of rebirth, is named. And it's called a Gandhabba. And a Gandhabba in classical Hindu thought and in early Buddhism is a type of deity. It here means the entity which is being reborn. Very strange. Okay, so there's lots of difficult elements in this text. Finally, it concludes with a fairly regular path of jhana, ending in liberation. Just to break it down into maybe something a little bit more workable, the 6 sections break down into 4 sections. The sections 1 and 2, I think, go together. Sections 5 and 6 also go together. So the text maybe isn't quite as complicated as we think. Okay, let's look at then the opening text to get a flavor. The core of the text is section 1. We're dealing with consciousness, which the Pali word is vijnana, and the dependent origination of it. So the Buddha starts off by saying to Sati, okay, Sati, where did you get this idea? Why do you think like this? What do you mean by vijnana? And Sati says, it is that which speaks, feels, and experiences the results of good and bad karma here and there. This is exactly like a statement from early Hinduism. So if we go back to the early Brahminic Hindu texts, you can find exact type of statements like this in the Upanishads. Sati has been influenced by the Upanishads, and he's giving that sort of idea. The Buddha then has clarified what Sati is talking about, and then he refutes him. The Buddha says there's no arising of consciousness without a cause. So vijnana for the Buddha is not some substantial entity which moves from one life to the next. It is something which only arises dependent on causes. So this is a basic Buddhist teaching, a basic principle of dependent origination. To clarify what the Buddha is talking about, he uses the example of fire. So fire is different depending upon what its fuel is. If you burn grass or logs or cow dung, the fire is different. It might smell different. It might look different. It has a different flavor. So that's the same with consciousness, according to the Buddha. Your visual consciousness is one thing. Your auditory consciousness is another. Your taste, your smell, feeling things on your body. These are all the different forms of consciousness in the Buddha's teaching. There is no essential core to that. So this is what exactly the Buddha says, how he explains what vijnana is. Consciousness gets defined in dependence on whatever causes it to arise. If it arises dependent on the eye and visual forms, it gets called eye consciousness. So eye consciousness, chakku vijnana. You cannot take the vijnana out of chakku vijnana and say that the vijnana is a real thing. There is only chakku vijnana, sota vijnana, ghana vijnana, different types of vijnana, different episodes of vijnana, mano vijnana. So all of these, there are 6 in total. A person's experience in the present consists of this flow of these different episodes, different types of vijnana. This is the Buddha's point. What Sati has done, he has elaborated from this. He has taken the vijnana out of these conditioned events. Okay, now this is where it gets a bit complicated. So far we have a fairly, I think, standard teaching on how the Buddha understands consciousness. But then the Buddha starts talking about something come into being. Bhutam idang. So the Buddha talks about this thing come into being, the arising of this thing come into being. and the cessation of this thing come into being. So the cessation of this thing come into being, the Buddha would ask, "O bhikkhus, this thing come into being, do you see that if it has no nutriment, it is subject to cessation, nirodha dhammang?" What is the Buddha talking about here? Buddhaghosa, the exegetical tradition, interprets bhuta as the 5 aggregates. Now, the 5 aggregates aren't mentioned in this text, and what we're talking about is one of the aggregates, vijnana. In fact, the way that the Buddha is talking about bhutang, idang, it makes it impossible for him to be talking about the 5 aggregates. That is not how the canonical texts discuss the 5 aggregates. So Buddhaghosa's interpretation from a historical point of view isn't correct. However, there's a very easy answer. The easy referent to bhutam idam, is vijnanam. Bhutam idam is we want a neuter noun. Vijnanam is a neuter noun. We've just been talking about vijnanam. We've been talking more specifically about vijnanam and its fuel, its cause. Now we're talking about vijnanam and its cause with a different metaphor. We're using the metaphor of food, nutriment. So this section, then the Buddha sort of cross-questions the bhikkhus about their understanding of consciousness. Do you see that consciousness only comes about under particular circumstances? Okay, so I'm going to jump to section 4 now. But just to reiterate then, sections 1 or 2 of the text, they seem to be coherent. This seems to be the Buddha talking about one particular thing in response to a particular situation when he was teaching. The Buddha is deconstructing consciousness. He is saying that consciousness is caused. And he's using 2 metaphors to talk about this causality. The metaphor of fuel and the metaphor of food. Consciousness is like almost a material thing. It's like fire. Take the fuel away and there is none of it. So consciousness isn't an intrinsically real substance. Okay, so just if we hold that thought in our head, now think about this, our present moment consciousness, we feel that it continues from the past to the present to the future. It seems like there is this seamless continuity. We have this feeling of being awake and it continuing. Now that is the common sense view that we have. That is what the Bhikkhu Sati is understanding consciousness as. And the Buddha is saying something more challenging. He's saying that this continuity isn't real. It's a sort of illusion we have. So from this perspective, section 4 of the text makes some sort of sense. If you understand that your present moment awareness is constructed, if you really understand that, the Buddha is saying, you won't ask questions such as, what will I be in the future? What was I in the past? How do I exist in the present? So if you have deconstructed your view of personal identity, these are questions that don't apply. Okay, so these are pretty challenging ideas. This is where the Buddha's Dhamma is quite difficult. It challenges how we think about ourselves. But in this text, we have what seems to be a coherent dialogue between the Buddha and his followers in sections 1, 2, and 4. We've missed out section 3. Now, this is where it gets pretty tricky as a text historical analysis. Section 3 seems to jump out of this analysis of present moment consciousness. The Buddha starts talking about 4 foods, 4 aharas, which he explains are material food, contact, intention, and consciousness. And he says that these are the supports for the endurance of beings who have come into being. and for assisting those beings seeking arising. So we have sort of moved slightly from the present moment focus. We're now talking about continuity over time. Okay, so the Buddha introduces these 4 foods. And then he says, okay, so what is the origin of these foods? And he says, it is thirst. What is the origin of thirst? It is sensation. What is the origin of sensation? It is contact. And so on and so on. It goes back through the chain of dependent origination. So we have the classical doctrine of dependent origination here. And for several pages, the text continues going backwards and forwards. As a text critical historian, I'm trying to answer the question when I read this, how has this text been expanded? The Buddha said himself it's a concise teaching, but it isn't concise. We're looking for things that have been added, and if something has been added, this looks like it could be it. What we have in section 3 is a section of text which is you giving new definitions to words that have been used in sections 1 and 2. So in sections 1 and 2 of the text, we have the words Bhuta, Ahara, Sambhava. In section 3, all of these words are being used differently. There is a very subtle conceptual difference. It's subtle, but real. So what seems to be happening is that we have another piece of tradition. That other piece of tradition is the classical doctrine. And at some point, as the texts are being transmitted from one generation to the other, one piece of text has been moved into another piece. Not written text, of course. We're still in the age of oral recitation. So just to present how I think the text has grown, sections 1, 2, and 4 that we've just been discussing, they seem to be the old core of the text. They fit together quite seamlessly. The ideas of them seem to form a nice continuous thread. You can follow it as one teaching. The Buddha, in a number of different ways that I cannot go into here also. The terminology, the style of discussion, it is a nice, concise Dhamma teaching. And then we have quite a long section 3, which comes in, it gives new definitions, and it gets away from the core teaching. So that is text critical history. We're looking at the different pieces of the tradition, trying to understand them. Okay, so just to go over what is happening here, what I think is happening. There is an old text. It's consisting of sections 1, 2, and 4. At some point, it's been expanded. And before the end, I'll talk about when I think this expansion might have happened. So the old core of the text, Sati, he thinks that this feeling of being conscious is a transmigrating substance. It's like a sort of soul that is talked about in Hinduism. The Buddha says, no, it certainly isn't. This is not my teaching, and he's very clear about that. We then get a section, which is number 3, with a very long teaching on dependent origination. It gets away from the gist of the core text. Okay, now that's not it. There's 2 more sections to discuss in the text. Sections 5 and 6, now they also look like an addition. I can't rule out the possibility that some form of them goes back to the original version of this text, but it also looks like it's adding new ideas. So we actually have a quite strange and wonderful teaching of dependent origination, beginning with the Gandhabba's descent into the womb of a mother. Okay, a woman becomes pregnant, is explained by the descent into the womb of some sort of thing, which will be reborn.